In the annals of American history, amidst the dust and echoes of battle, there emerges a figure whose story transcends time. Meet Fred Goldin, recipient of the Medal of Honor and the last man to see General Custer alive in the fateful battle of the Little Bighorn. In the heart of the untamed West, amidst the thundering hooves and the clash of steel, Fred Goldin stood as a witness to history. His valor and courage under fire are etched into the very fabric of the American spirit. As we stand on the precipice of time, let us remember the bravery and sacrifice of those who came before us. Join us as we journey into the untold depths of heroism and honor, guided by the indomitable spirit of Fred Goldin, the last sentinel of a bygone era. But before we start the video, please subscribe. American Old West Tales.
Theodore W. Goldin, hailing from Janesville, Wisconsin and a former trooper of the 7th Cavalry. He holds the distinction of being among the last or possibly the penultimate individuals to have witnessed Custer alive. He had known General Custer since joining the regiment in 1873 until the time of Custer's tragic demise. He had campaigned alongside Custer and the regiment except for the year 1875, when the troop to which he was assigned was stationed in the South. In the early spring of 1876, they were informed that an expedition was being prepared against the Sioux. Shortly after, they received their marching orders, and their battalion relocated from near Shreveport, Louisiana, to Fort Lincoln, Dakota Territory. Upon their arrival, General Custer was in Washington, appearing before an investigating committee. He only rejoined the regiment a few days before their column embarked on the field, as he had been placed under arrest in Chicago while traveling from Washington. He won't delve into the details of their march from Fort Lincoln to the Yellowstone, where they reached near the mouth of the Powder River. They stayed there for a few days, preparing their pack train for the journey. It was decided to abandon their wagons and establish a supply camp at that location. A few days earlier, Major Reno had departed on a scouting mission, anticipating to rejoin them near the mouth of the Tongue River by June 17th. Arrangements were made to leave behind their wagon train, some dismounted recruits, and the regimental band at the Powder River. They then moved camp to the mouth of the Tongue River, where they remained on June 17th, the same day General Crook engaged in a significant battle with the Indians on the Rosebud. Throughout the day, they anxiously scanned the horizon for signs of Major Reno's command, but hearing nothing, they broke camp on the morning of the 18th and proceeded up the valley. They eventually met up with Reno's forces soon after noon. In the preceding days, they couldn't help but notice General Custer's change in demeanor. Unlike his usual self, he appeared moody, discontented, and somewhat nervous and agitated. When Reno returned with his report, he seemed like a different person. His usual vigor and decisiveness were evident in how quickly he got the command ready to march and led them towards the Rosebud. General Terry, aboard our supply steamer Far West, had already headed in that direction in hopes of linking up with General Gibbon's command, known to be nearby. We marched late into the night, finally reaching the Yellowstone and setting up camp, confident that we would intercept the steamer if it was downstream. The next morning we were up early and on horseback. By midday we spotted General Gibbon's wagon train slowly making its way up the river, and shortly after, the Far West appeared on the horizon. Couriers were dispatched to inform them that Reno had found signs of a large group of Indians. In no time, we were camped near the mouth of the Rosebud, and a war council was convened to discuss Reno's report in detail. The next day, preparations were made for an intense campaign. On the night of the 21st, a final meeting took place aboard the steamer, from what I recall. During this meeting, General Custer received his ultimate orders, which align closely with your previous description. As this meeting concluded, General Gibbon was asked when he could arrive at the mouth of the Little Bighorn River. Not before the 26th at noon, he retorted. During this gathering, it was mentioned that Custer had been offered the battalion of the 2nd Cavalry and the artillery from the steamer. However, he turned down both offers, stating that he knew his troops well enough to prefer leading them alone. He also expressed concern that the artillery might slow down his advance when nearing the enemy. While some officers and men suspected this was part of a plan to secure an independent command, a position Custer had been accustomed to for years, his request was granted. In the afternoon of June 22nd, we paraded before Generals Terry and Gibbon and soon found the trail described by Major Reno. From then until Reno discovered the Indian village, we stayed on that trail, except when we needed to find a suitable camping spot. Despite being instructed to scout the area and send a courier to General Gibbon, we didn't do either, even though a scout named George Herendeen was assigned to us for that purpose. Our marches were lengthy, and we moved swiftly until the night of the 24th when we veered off the trail for a distance and appeared to settle in for the night. However, it was merely a trick to deceive the Indians, as we had orders not to unpack our gear and to be ready for a night march. From the moment we departed from the Rosebud, General Custer displayed a noticeable change in demeanor. His characteristic restless energy had returned, and his sole focus seemed to be on reaching and engaging the Indians. It's worth mentioning that the trail we followed originated from the direction of the Missouri River. According to the estimates of Bloody Knife and some of our Crow Scouts, it suggested a group of between 1,000 to 1,200 Indians, primarily consisting of warriors who had come from the Missouri River agencies. Around 11 o'clock, we received orders to saddle up and form a line. Meanwhile, a scouting party comprising Crows, Reese, and some of our officers, including Lieutenant Varnum and possibly Lieutenant Hare, had advanced ahead of us to scout the trail across the divide and attempt to locate the Indians. Departing from our campsite, we resumed following the trail and pressed onward, aiming to traverse the divide and reach the shelter of the foothills along the Little Bighorn River before daybreak the next morning. However, due to the rugged terrain and challenges in scouting the trail, we were unable to achieve this goal. When daybreak arrived, we found ourselves in a ravine at the base of towering bluffs, unsure of our distance from the river. Sometime during the night, it was rumored that General Custer had forged ahead and joined the scouts. Just after daybreak, they supposedly informed him that they had located the village in the valley of the Little Bighorn. However, General Custer expressed disbelief in their report. Meanwhile, it became evident that our presence in the area was detected when, during the night, a box of ammunition went missing. A detachment sent to retrieve it encountered Indians attempting to open the box. During the discussion, as the division in the command was being discussed, Mitch Bouillet, a half-breed Crow interpreter, warned General Custer that there were more Indians in the valley than their command could handle. Custer responded by suggesting that if Bouillet was scared, he could stay behind. Bouillet replied that he wasn't afraid to go wherever Custer went, but warned that neither of them would likely survive if they ventured into the valley. Just before the advance, Lieutenant McIntosh assigned me to report to General Custer as orderly, and I promptly did so. The general instructed me to accompany Lieutenant Cook, our regimental adjutant, and assist him with any tasks he assigned. During our brief stop, most of the men had laid down on the ground and drifted off to sleep, while the horses grazed among the sagebrush. General Custer gave the order to advance, stating that the company in each battalion that was first ready would take the right of the line. Within minutes, we were all back in the saddle. It had been decided during the halt that Benteen and his battalion would head off to the left, scouting the area in that direction and driving away any Indians they came across, while also relaying any findings to the main command. General Custer, with 5 troops, pulled off to the right, and McDougal and the pack train did their best to follow, with Reno to stay on the trail. We promptly resumed the march in accordance with these instructions, and after about 30 minutes of hard riding, the rugged terrain forced General Custer's column to veer left. Soon, we caught up with Major Reno's command, which was making its way along the trail as quickly as the difficult ascent allowed. After a challenging climb, we reached the top of the ridge, where we could see a rolling plateau stretching towards the river foothills, about 5 or 6 miles away. As our unit hurried over the divide, we spotted Reno far ahead, swiftly making his way down the trail. Several miles to our left, Colonel Benteen's command scouted the bluffs as ordered. We followed Reno's general direction for a while, but remained behind and to his right. To those of us nearby, it seemed like Custer was impatient with the perceived slow pace of our advance. At times, he would dash ahead of the column, then slow down to wait for us to catch up, only to dash off again. Around this time, we noticed a large dust cloud moving down the river valley, but couldn't discern its origin. Upon this discovery, Custer rode towards the river, accompanied only by his orderly trumpeter. He paused momentarily atop a high pinnacle, waving his hat, seemingly in greeting to someone in the distance before swiftly returning to the head of the column, led by Captain Keogh and I Troop, veterans of numerous battles. With excitement evident in his eyes, Custer approached Keogh and exclaimed, "Keogh, those Indians are on the run. If we can keep them fleeing, we can afford to lose half the horses in the command." Cool and collected as if on parade, Keogh calmly turned in his saddle and glanced back at the long line of eager, weathered, bearded faces. Addressing Custer, Keogh declared, "General, we'll do everything humanly possible with both man and horse." Moments later, the bugles blared, signaling the charge, the first bugle note since leaving the Rosebud. With thunderous momentum, we surged northward along the river, attempting multiple times to descend into the valley below, albeit without success. After perhaps the third failed attempt, General Custer quickly conferred with Captain W. Cook for a brief moment. Cook then pulled out his notepad and swiftly jotted down a few lines, which he folded up, simultaneously calling for an orderly. Since I was the first to approach him, he gave me the paper containing the order. "Deliver this to Major Reno, stay with him until we rendezvous, then report back to me immediately," he instructed before darting off. In an instant, the rear of the column sped past me, disappearing into the ravines. Taking a quick glance after them, I realized the danger of being alone in such hostile territory. Without hesitation, I wasted no time in heading towards Reno's command, guided by the dust cloud hovering over them. Fortunately, I encountered minimal interference along the way. While a few shots were fired from a distance, they only spurred me to hasten my pace, eager to reach friendly forces. After a ride of about 5 or 6 miles, I caught up with Reno just as he was dismounting to engage in foot combat. Delivering my dispatch, the contents of which I remained unaware, Reno quickly glanced at it and tucked it away in his pocket. Around this time, the Re-Scouts became startled, and, as we later discovered, didn't regain their composure until they reached the Powder River and the protection of the wagon train. It quickly became evident that the Indians were outflanking us and closing in from behind. We had to turn around and fend off their advances until we could guide our horses into the nearby timber. In the process, several horses were hit, and a couple were spooked and ran off. Eventually, we retreated into the safety of the timber where we could mount a more effective defense. Shortly after, we observed Captain Moylan preparing his troop for action. Lieutenant Wallace, positioned nearby on the skirmish line, called out to Captain French, who commanded the center company, to inquire about the orders. French responded that he hadn't received any specific instructions but would try to find out. After a few minutes, he informed us that they were planning to charge, although no formal orders had been issued. Nonetheless, he suggested that we mount up and provide support. We received orders to reach our horses, and during this process, we found that around 15 of our men had been dismounted due to either gunfire or their horses panicking. Lieutenant McIntosh had lost his horse and borrowed one from a trooper named McCormick, who surrendered it with the grim comment that we were all doomed anyway, so he might as well face it on foot. Mounting up, we rode out of the timber and were surprised to see that instead of charging the Indians, Reno was executing a strategic maneuver by charging the bluffs on the opposite side of the river. Upon realizing this, the Indians massed on our flanks and unleashed a heavy barrage of gunfire on the retreating column. Fortunately, their marksmanship while mounted was poor, and we suffered relatively minor casualties during this chaotic retreat, which resembled a stampede. It's been said that Reno got so worked up that he emptied his revolver at the Indians and then tossed the weapon aside. However, I happen to know this isn't true, as the revolver is currently in the possession of General Benteen or his family, or was a few years back. During this retreat, I was riding on the left side of our column near the timber. When we were almost within sight of the river, my horse stumbled and threw me into a clump of sagebrush. Luckily, I wasn't seriously hurt, just a few scrapes on the surface. As I scrambled to my feet, Lieutenant Wallace passed me, yelling for me to head for the timber as my horse was down. I didn't pause to confirm his report, but followed his advice, only encountering a couple of obstacles before reaching the safety of the timber. From my hidden vantage point, I watched as our men urged their horses into the river, navigating through the rocky terrain. I observed Lieutenant Hodgson's horse plunge into the stream, witnessing the lieutenant struggle as if injured. He managed to free himself from the stirrups and clung to the stirrup strap of a passing trooper, using it to guide himself across the water. As soon as he reached the bank, it became evident that he had been wounded, but he bravely persevered. The trooper appeared to be attempting to assist him onto the saddle from behind, but couldn't risk stopping his horse. Moments later, Hodgson appeared to be struck again, losing his grip and tumbling to the ground. He managed to rise to his feet and attempted to reach another comrade who halted to assist him. Just as it seemed he might be saved, the second trooper suddenly collapsed from his horse. Hodgson then tried to make his way toward the ravine, where the rest of the command was disappearing. Despite his efforts, he stumbled and fell repeatedly. Eventually, realizing further retreat was futile, he turned to confront the Indians, drawing his revolver and returning fire. Shortly after, gunfire erupted from my side of the river, and I watched as Hodgson staggered and fell, knowing it was the end. Meanwhile, our men had successfully crossed the river and ascended a nearby ravine, except for those unfortunate souls who met their demise at the ford, which was particularly treacherous. Left alone, I pondered my own fate, but fortunately I remained unnoticed and unharmed, as the Indians were preoccupied with looting and defiling the bodies of our fallen comrades along the riverbanks. Around that time, I could hear the intense sounds of gunfire downstream, leading me to believe that Custer was locked in combat with the Indians. From the brief glimpses I caught of the village, it was evident to me that he faced overwhelming odds, much like our own situation. Many of the Indians in our vicinity quickly dispersed, urging their ponies onward as they rushed to reinforce their comrades at the lower end of the village. At that moment, I spotted the scout, George Herendine, some distance away heading toward the river. I called out to him, and soon we were reunited. He informed me that the 15 dismounted men from our group had sought refuge in the timber about 200 yards from our position. However, in their attempt to approach the river, they were repeatedly targeted by Indian gunfire. Before departing from our location, the Indians had ignited the river bottom, likely to obscure their movements or to smoke out our wounded comrades. Surprisingly, this smoke provided cover for us as we navigated our way to the river, crossing it with difficulty. Eventually, we stumbled upon one of our Crow scouts, who directed us to the whereabouts of our unit, and we quickly rejoined them. We discovered that Benteen and his battalion had arrived there, but there was no information about the whereabouts of Custer and his unit. We relayed what we had witnessed and heard. It was around that moment that someone noticed a white flag flying from a location near where Herndon and I had taken cover in the river bottom. Lieutenant Hare, at great risk, crept down to a bluff overlooking the valley. After a series of signals, he assured the party that we were allies. They then crossed the river and joined us, revealing themselves to be the dismounted men who had been abandoned when Reno retreated. I forgot to mention that during our retreat, Lieutenant McIntosh riding McCormick's horse was ahead of me by several yards. I noticed that somehow his lasso had come loose and was dragging on the ground, hitting sagebrush and other obstacles, making his area very hazardous. Some of the men tried to get his attention, but it seems he didn't hear them. Shortly after, I saw his horse fall, but I couldn't tell if he was shot. All I could see as I rode past was that the lieutenant was lying where he fell, and appeared either dead or unconscious, likely dead, as we found him in the same spot the day after the Indians left us. While we stood on the bluffs overlooking the valley, I overheard some heated conversation nearby. Captain Weir exclaimed, "Well, by God, if you won't go, I will, and if we ever get out of here alive, someone will pay for this." He then walked off, and shortly after, I witnessed D Troop mount up and ride down the valley toward the distant gunfire. Without apparent orders, the entire unit followed them, lacking any military formation except for the 2 troops led by Benteen and Godfrey. We advanced down the valley for some distance until we spotted Weir and his troop retreating from a significantly larger group of Indians. Quickly organizing ourselves into a line, we halted the advancing group until Weir and his troops had passed beyond our ranks and regrouped some distance behind us. With assistance from some of our nearby men, they established their position and opened fire, allowing us to retreat and regroup behind them. We continued to fall back for a short distance until Colonel Benteen, who appeared to be leading our section, addressed Lieutenant Wallace. "Wallace, there's no point in retreating any farther. Form your troop here, with your right flank resting on this spot, and we'll make a stand." Wallace grinned and replied, "I don't have a troop, just 2 men. Benteen chuckled grimly and retorted, "Form yourself and your 2 men there, and I'll let you know more when I figure it out myself." That marked the start of our defensive line. Soon others joined us, and we took cover behind sagebrush and hastily piled mounds of dirt, opening fire to keep the Indians at bay until darkness provided some relief. Overnight, we adjusted our position slightly, located our corral and hospital, and fortified ourselves as best we could. At dawn, the fighting resumed and continued unabated until around 3 in the afternoon. To our surprise, the Indians began dismantling their teepees, packing their travois, and within a few hours they were moving up the river valley in a massive procession of ponies, travois, and Indians, frustratingly just beyond rifle range. Twice that afternoon, groups of volunteers went to fetch water, but both times they were fired upon by the Indians. Unfortunately, it was only on the second trip that someone was hit. Poor Madden from K Troop was the unlucky one. His leg was shattered 3 times between the ankle and the knee. That evening, we transported him back to the hospital to have his leg removed. The next day, Generals Terry and Gibbon arrived to provide assistance. Through them, we finally learned the true fate of our comrades from the other battalion. On the 28th, after ferrying our wounded across the river, we went to the battle site and buried the fallen soldiers we found. Almost every body on the field, except General Custer's, showed signs of mutilation, but as far as I remember, our leader's body was untouched. Given the limited space available, it's challenging to delve into the specific incidents of the battle or provide detailed descriptions. Since the battle, I've had discussions with numerous Army officers and individuals with frontier experience. The prevailing consensus appears to identify 2, perhaps 3, primary reasons for the disaster. Firstly, the division of the command into essentially 4 separate columns, while still some 15 miles from the battlefield, without precise knowledge of the enemy's exact location or approximate strength. This division led to a critical lack of support among the columns during crucial moments of the fight. Secondly, Custer's premature encounter with the enemy, occurring nearly 24 hours ahead of schedule. Thirdly, the loss of the horses and a significant portion of the surplus ammunition from Custer's command has been extensively debated by more qualified individuals than myself, so I won't delve into it here. My personal experiences with General Custer have always portrayed him as daringly brave, often willing to take risks without fully assessing the odds against him. I've often considered that one potential reason for his actions, despite the orders he received, could be linked to his deep sense of the apparent disgrace from the treatment he received from the president. It's plausible that he believed a bold charge and a resounding victory, akin to his success at Washita, could redeem his reputation and restore his status as a preeminent leader and Indian fighter. Regardless of his motives, it's undeniable that he fought valiantly and sacrificed his life alongside comrades who had shared victory with him in many previous battles.